Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Emily Spranger. I am an academic trainer in the Center for Teaching and Learning. I am joined here today by my colleague, Esther Archange, who is also an academic trainer. She will be in the chat, facilitating conversation and in the Q&A as well. And we are very happy to have one of our own NCU faculty presenting today, Dr. Lori Bedford from the School of Education. Couple of housekeeping items. Please note that if you want everyone to know your comments in the chat, make sure to select the drop-down option that allows you to select everyone. Dr. Bedford has mentioned that she'd be happy for you to have conversation in the chat, so please feel free to do that. But if you do have questions, please post those questions in the Q&A, just so we don't lose anything in the chat and we're able to ask those questions as time permits. If you would like to see the subtitles of this webinar, you can actually select by the live transcript option at the bottom of your Zoom. You can select show subtitle and you'll be able to read the transcript as this presentation continues. And as always, this webinar is being recorded and we will post it in our CTL webinar LibGuides page for future reference. So without any more introduction, I am going to pass it over to Dr. Bedford.
Thanks, Emily, and it's great to have you here and on board with us, Esther, as well. Great to see you all here today. As Emily noted, my name's Lori Bedford. I'm a faculty member, a full-time faculty member with the School of Education, and I teach mainly research methods courses there and work with doctoral students. And in doing so, one of the interest areas that I have developed is how to provide support for non-native English speaking students who come into our doctoral programs and need that support. So I've been doing some work in this area. I've been taking some classes, doing some research, and I'm by no means an expert in this. I really just wanted to share with you all some of the things that I've learned, and more so some of the things that I have been thinking about. And so I'd really like for this conversation for this presentation to be a conversation. So I welcome conversation in the chat. Please feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand. And Emily, do the participants have the option to unmute themselves and just talk?
Yes, they absolutely do. All they'll need to do is raise their hand and then I can allow them to speak.
Okay, super. So yeah, so Emily will facilitate that. And so I'm hoping to get some conversation today. I've seen a lot of folks from the various schools that I know. And so it's great to have you colleagues here today and also some new colleagues to meet you as well. So just a few of the things that we will be talking about today. We'll talk a little bit about who the non-native English speaking students are. Two areas that we'll focus on are feedback and writing. There's lots of other things we can talk about, but we only have an hour. So we're going to talk a little bit about feedback and specifically writing support. And then we're going to talk about, how we're going to look at a case example and how some of the things that we talk about can specifically meet the needs of some students. So getting started here, I'd like to hear your feedback and think about the non-native English speaking students that you have in your classes right now, whether it be in content classes, whether it be as doctoral learners in a sequence, or if you're a student, maybe you have non-native English speaking students in other types of classes you teach, whether it be community college, K-12, other institutions. So either type in the chat or raise your hand and just share a little bit about what you know or what you've observed or experienced about students who are non-native English speakers.
And we'll just give you just a few seconds if you feel comfortable to pop something in the chat, or you can always raise your hand and share a thought as well too. And then you can also always post something in the Q&A too. if you want to go that route as well.
And you can always just reflect and write some notes for yourself as we're going through. If you prefer not to share those, that's fine too.
Absolutely. We do have one person who's raised their hand and would like to share their thoughts on that. If you are able to unmute yourself, Sharon, hopefully.
Yes, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
So actually, I'm bilingual. My first language is Spanish. And my dissertation that I'm planning to do is actually on experience of therapists with non-native speaking clients. And eventually I would like to open a Spanish department at NCU because one of the biggest struggles is when you speak two languages is trying to understand some of the verbiage because the translation is not the same. And so when you're trying to read things, it's like it doesn't make sense. So sometimes you need additional maybe like just explaining it to you in a different way so that you can understand what it is that they're trying to say because it's not making sense once you translate it into Spanish. Yeah, at least for me, it's Spanish because that's the language. So I often have to, keep going back and asking my professors, like, can you please explain this to me and what you mean? Because it's not making sense. So that's been my experience as far as once I've spoken the language. Just kind of like needing additional help with explaining certain things because it's not, the translation's not the same. The words don't translate the same. So yes. And when trying to do work with clients, it's hard too because the material is not in Spanish. The therapy is not in Spanish. So I'm trying to translate now from English into Spanish on the spot, like a quick thing. So yes, that's the experience I've had.
That's a great recommendation. Anything you want to expand on that, Dr. Bedford? There's lots in the chat too. Thank you so much, Sharon.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, because a couple of things that you talked about, we are going to talk about. So I think that we will address some of the things that you said a little bit later. So thanks so much for that.
Absolutely. Can I mention some of the things in the chat?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say next, Emily. Yeah, please go ahead and share some of the wonderful comments that are in the chat.
I know, really. There's several comments here. I'm just going to mention it just because in the recording, obviously, no one will know. So in the chat, some things that were mentioned in regards to this topic, they sometimes have a hesitancy to approach faculty and others for help. Often, these students might shy away from participating in discussion for fear of embarrassment, especially with pronunciation. One challenge is overly reliant on software thesaurus tools that don't do well for ESL students. And stigma associated with accent when it comes into participation and discussions. Oh my goodness, there's so much. One more. One more. I teach in a K through 12 setting, and we have learned that too much feedback can be overwhelming and defeating. We should be selective in what kind of feedback we provide. A lot of recast is important. And there's more, but I thought I would pause and see what you think.
Yeah, there's a lot. And I think that's a really nice selection, Emily, I do know you. I did want to just take a moment here. Karen says, hi, just wanted to be sure I know the difference between ELLs and non-native English speakers so I can use the terms correctly and what I can do to support their learning. And Karen and everyone else, in this webinar, we're really talking about the same group of people. We're talking about individuals who their first language, they consider their first language to be something other than English. So that can encompass ELLs, it can encompass folks. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of these various groups of non-native English speakers. And so that's kind of a different conversation, the nuances between those terms. But in this, presentation, we're really kind of talking about those folks who need support with their English speaking skills. So for this presentation, it doesn't matter what group they fall in, but it does matter. So good, glad I answered your question, Karen. Thank you for posing that. That was a good one. So I do want to talk just a minute about, just take a step back now that we've talked a little bit about what we know about non-native English speakers. And I do want to say before we move into this slide that one of the things that I have noticed since I've started thinking about this and learning about this, and the more I talk about supporting non-native English speakers with other faculty, is that, it starts becoming like, well, aren't these strategies good for everybody? And yeah, they are. Good pedagogy is good pedagogy. So there really aren't strategies just for one group of learners. The strategies really kind of transcend groups. Some strategies work for individuals, some good for one individual. Other strategies are good for another individual. We kind of group them, but I think we need to remember that we really can't generalize groups of students or groups of individuals. That as we're talking about good teaching, it's just good teaching regardless of who the students are. So that's one thing that I kind of try to keep in mind. Emily, did John have a question? Did he have his hand up?
He did, and I was thinking maybe he wanted to share something from the previous slide. Would it be okay if I?
Absolutely, you bet.
Okay, great.
Yep.
John, let me see here. Oh no, I think I just lost him.
Oh no.
Oh no, he's here. He's here.
Hi, John.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you are. Please, would it be okay if you address the question of what is non-native English speaker? Because some cultures, you learn English with another language simultaneously. And also, the English language ranges from Australia to Zimbabwe.
Yep.
English, it has varieties. So those are some of the challenges some of us encounter. Besides that, if you are proofreading your work with Grammarly, sometimes there's a little bit difference between the British English and the American English. And sometimes professors only focus on American English. And we can tell them that, why don't you look at other forms of the English language? Yeah. So I want to bring that to your attention, whether you'll be willing to address that too.
Yeah, great points, John. And I think that exemplifies that we just really can't generalize. English, non-native English speakers are not one group of students. They're not one group of individuals. They're individuals who encompass a broad range of abilities and languages and preferences and points in their life in which they started to speak English. And in the next slide, we're going to talk about that a little bit more, the different groups. So thank you for bringing that up. And I think those are really great points to remember as we're going through this presentation, as well as when we're working with students.
Okay, thank you very much.
You bet, John.
Yeah.
So a couple of other things that I just kind of want to set some context for. So when we're talking about non-native English speakers or English language learners, more in the K-12 setting, one of the things that differentiates the group of students who speak a language other than English is the identification. So we know that in K-12 education, English language learners are identified and provided with supplemental services. And in higher education, of course, that's not true. So a non-native English speaker or an English language learner needs to self-identify and seek out those services. There is a level of demonstrated proficiency that's required for non-native English speakers to begin most education programs, including at NCU. Those are minimal standards. So a non-native English speaker can demonstrate that they have the language skills to begin to work in their program and begin that academic journey. But as we know, language acquisition is a lifelong process, even for native speakers of any language, we continually learn vocabulary and how to articulate ourselves in various ways. And we add just to our repertoire of the ways that we are able to express ourselves. So we need to think of that in terms of demonstrated proficiency, that when we come into an academic program, we aren't at one point in time, but we're always moving forward in terms of our language proficiency, regardless of the language or languages that we speak. And then, as I said, you know, there really is a lot of diversity among non-native English speakers. As John pointed out, there's different dialects of English that they may have learned. There's different points in a person's life when they begin the journey to learn a second or third language. Students who are non-native English speakers may have learned English for a variety of reasons. And so we need to think about all of that when we're working with students. And just a last point on this. So as faculty, students are not necessarily identified as such when they come into our classroom. So how do we know? You know, I ask students, you know, I get to know them. I ask them about their background. I ask them, you know, where they live, where they have lived, and typically that will come up in conversation. So I think that that exemplifies really the importance of getting to know our students. So this is what I was talking just a little bit about diversity, and there are many subgroups of these groups of non-English speakers, non-native English speakers, but I kind of have lumped them into three groups. So we have international students, students who live in countries other than the US, who live in those countries that a language other than English is the language that's spoken, and they happen to speak English and attend NCU. There's also recent immigrants who may have studied English in their home country and have recently moved to the United States, or perhaps they came here under a variety of circumstances and are just learning English now. We have students like that. Those two groups of students are easier, or they come to our attention in a little bit easier way. If a student is living in another country, the conversation about their language proficiency usually comes up. If they're recent immigrants, if they tell us that, their language proficiency and preferences can also come up. The group of students that it's more difficult to kind of understand and be aware of their circumstances are these generation 1.5 students. And this is really a large group of students. They're very diverse, and we really can't generalize. But if we were going to, some things that we would notice about these students. So generation 1.5 students are students who typically have grown up in the United States, and so they have gone to school speaking English. However, in their home, another language may be spoken. They may have come to the United States as children, and they spoke a language other than English and learned as they were going to school. So for most of these students, their conversational English is fluent. And as you are getting to know them, as you're talking with them, it's not clear that they have spoken a language other than English, or that that may be a more preferred language other than English. Students who've grown up in the United States speaking English, they understand colloquialisms, they understand cultural references. If you refer to something that's on TV, they'll get that. They often don't have accents and sound like native speakers. And something that's important, and we'll talk about this a little later on too, is that students who in this category have learned English mostly through listening and speaking rather than reading and writing, which we know are important to the academic process. And so the point of this is that all of these groups of students, in particular the Generation 1.5 students, they may not have knowledge of academic English. So they understand and are able to use conversational English in a very fluent way, but that academic English is sometimes difficult for them. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between academic and conversational English. And I'm not going to go into this in real depth because this is a whole presentation in and of itself. And I'm certainly not the expert with this. But there are two levels of conversation according to Cummins. And this is the Iceberg Theory that he's known for. So basically, it's really kind of what I just described, that the tip of the iceberg are those conversational skills. And we are able to, or English language learners are able to understand and communicate in an interpersonal way, oftentimes based on context. So we see things, we hear things, we understand kind of the broader picture. There may be gestures, there may be visual cues that help us engage in that everyday conversation. So for example, if we're in the grocery store and I'm looking at the apples and I pick one up and I say, hey, would you like me to buy some apples? You see I'm holding an apple. Yeah, why don't you buy some? So those cues that I have make it very clear what I'm talking about, even if you don't know what the word apple means. So we need to compare that or juxtapose that then to the academic language. Academic language involves knowledge, critical thinking, linguistics, research skills, but it lacks that context. And so if we say something like, we need to have evidence that we need to have evidence of this situation, something like that. And by evidence, I mean, we need to find literature, studies, research that support this. But if your language and your academic language is not developed to the point where you don't have the context for what I mean by evidence, that's difficult to understand. And I think, and I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. You spoke so eloquently at the beginning of the webinar about it's not always clear what the faculty member is talking about. And so that clarity needs to be provided with context, with additional feedback, with conversations as needed, and those kinds of extra supports. And again, as I said, it's not just English language learners. Many students, particularly at NCU and other institutions that really reach out and serve a variety of populations, students don't always understand that academic language and they don't always understand what professors mean. And so I think that's something that I think we can be really cognizant about regardless of the student population. And Sharon, I see that you asked what 1.5 stands for. I don't know. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what it does. It's past, you know, the one is the are the immigrants, the people, you know, who speak a language other than English. And then the 1.5 are the students kind of in between the native speakers. So I think it has something to do with that, but I'm not an expert on that. And so I'm not exactly sure, but I think it has something to do with that. It's kind of like Web 2.0, Web 3.0. I think it has something to do. Could be a generational thing. Yeah. Sorry, I don't have the answer to that, but that's a great question. So just back to a little bit about that academic language. So when we're talking about English language learning, there are lists of frequently used words. And so those are the words that when people are learning English, those are the vocabulary words they study, those words that are used the most in the English language. There's also a list of words that are frequently used in academia, and this is just some of them. So when I look at these words, and I think about how it would be if I didn't understand, or if I didn't have some of these words in my vocabulary, like context, interpretation, indicate, consistent. You know, some of those words are very important to the academic process. And if you don't have those words, it would be really difficult to understand what the faculty member's saying, perhaps understand what an assignment might be asking for in a classroom. And so we can look up these words in the dictionary, but in academia, sometimes they're nuanced. So I think it's just something to be aware of, that when students, and again, any student, perhaps doesn't respond to feedback in the way that you've asked, or seems to ignore feedback, or doesn't progress in the way that we had expected, it might be perhaps in the words that we're using, and we may need to provide some maybe context for that, or some conversation around that. And we're going to talk about some specific strategies here in a little bit. But before we move to the next slide, Emily, were there any other questions?
At this time, here, let me see.
I didn't see anything in the chat.
Got one, a hand raised. So let me go ahead. Sharon, are you able to unmute?
Yes.
Great.
So the question that I have, Dr. Bedford, was when you were talking about like them explaining to us, you know, in addition, or just kind of rephrasing the word. That's usually what I ask my professors. Can you please rephrase this for me so I can understand? Another thing that makes it a little bit hard is when the material is not organized, because you're already trying to make sense of the stuff in your head between that translation from Spanish to English and English to Spanish and so forth. And if the material is not like organized, or everything's all over the place, like with theories or different things, then it can make it a little bit more challenging, like qualitative research, quantitative research. If it's all over the place and it's not being like, there's no structure to it, and you're just kind of like learning this and just everywhere, it makes it even more so challenging when you're trying to do that translation back and forth and keeping everything together. So I just wanted to point that out as you were talking about that aside from the, clarification or rephrasing, that's also something that can make it difficult when you're trying to just keep everything together in your head.
Great points. Thank you so much for sharing that, Sharon. Yeah, I think those are great points. And so the implications for this are beyond instruction, but also would be reflected in instructional design and in materials and resources and supports. Good ideas. So next, I kind of wanted to put this in the context of a hypothetical student. And so this is kind of a long overview of this student. And you can go ahead and read it. But basically, this student is an immigrant. And he speaks English. He has fluent conversational English. And in his home country, he was an administrator in a healthcare facility, but his license doesn't work in the United States. So he wants to get a doctorate of health, a doctorate in a health administration program, and he wants to work in a local hospital where his native language can be useful. He can work as a translator. He, as you see here, he's also got a lot going on. He has, I'm just trying to move my chat here out of the way here. He's got a couple school-age children, one who has a chronic health condition. He just came back from a 4-month leave of absence. And he is really a motivated student. He wants to complete his degree. He does everything he's asked to do, but sometimes he needs more time just because of all of his competing priorities. He's working as a translator in a hospital, and he's an Uber driver on the side. He knows about the services at the university, like the ASC. He just doesn't have time to use them. So, some of this describes lots of students at NCU, just with a lot of the competing priorities with work and family and healthcare issues. And then on top of it, then he has this English speaking kind of additional barrier going on. So I want you to think about Saeed as we're moving into the next few slides. We're going to just talk about some feedback strategies and writing support strategies, and think about how those strategies might help Saeed to be successful. We'll come back to him at the end. So let's just have a little conversation here before we get started talking about feedback strategies. For those of us that are faculty, regardless if you're faculty here at NCU or anywhere else, what kinds of feedback strategies do you use with your students? And you can raise your hand or type into the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with.
Let's see here, as people are posting some of their thoughts or they're raising their hands. I used to teach adjunct at a community college, and one of the feedback strategies that I would do to help a student comprehend what was happening in the classroom was I would actually model some sort of demonstration, showing them what I wanted them to do. And that's not, I taught dance, so it doesn't have to be a physical demonstration, but it can be looking at it through a different lens of how to provide the feedback that they need so they can improve whatever the process is. Because you can also do that through writing strategies as well too. Mm-hmm. So modeling that behavior or modeling whatever it might be that you're trying to have the student improve upon. Something is, oh, go ahead.
No, finish, please.
Oh, something popped up. That's just an example. I thought I would share while people are starting to get their juices flowing.
Yeah, no, I was going to just say, I'm sorry. I was just going to say with regard to that. Yeah, I really like that, in terms of modeling. I mean, it can be samples of exemplar work, or it can just be in how we express ourselves. So, if I am asking students to use citations, maybe I should use them too.
Exactly. I used to teach a dance history class online as well too, and I would get a lot of APA questions, and that's a great example. Yeah. So couple of people, and then I have someone who's raised their hand. Karen mentioned, I like the sandwich method, starting with something positive and what needs to be worked on, and provide support and resources to guide them, then ending with something positive. I love this model too.
Mm-hmm. I do too, yeah.
I give suggestions of alternate words that are more commonly used in the discipline to describe concept more specifically. That's a great idea. Include audio or video feedback with examples. Also a great idea.
Yeah, I just want to say with regard to that one too, Emily. Yeah, the video and audio, and that's a great example. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But in terms of vocabulary, so sometimes it for any student, this just isn't the word we use in academics. This just isn't the word we use in research. One of the words that just comes to mind is subjects. Our research subjects. The more common term is participants. And so, as faculty, we can dance around that and try to get the student to come up with them on their own, or we can just do some direct instruction and give them the language to use. and, help the student move forward working on the content rather than finding and searching for that vocabulary word. So, that's certainly an instructional decision, but sometimes that's something to really think about whether or not the direct instruction approach with vocabulary may be the way to go.
Absolutely. And good point on that with the vocabulary aspect. And let's see, I'm going to see if I believe it's Jamie. So please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to see if you're able to unmute yourself by chance so you can share your thought. Hopefully. Oh, are you able to unmute yourself? And forgive me, I might be saying it wrong. It's Jamie from what I can see, or Saunders. Okay, I'm going to move on. Well, maybe you unmute yourself in the meantime, but a couple of things in here that I think are great as well too. So a big part of my teaching in the chat, this is in the chat, big part of my teaching is detailed feedback and opportunities to revise and resubmit. Couple more things in here. I often have students use their cell phones and look for definitions of words online. So trying to utilize technology to your advantage there.
Yep.
And let's see, in terms of academic writing terms, as a booklet that ESL can use when writing or they need to during presentations. That's a good idea as well too.
Mm-hmm. That's a great idea. Yeah. I mean, the words, particularly in academia, the words are there. I mean, we know those commonly used words. So I think to be cognizant and perhaps just be aware and help students be aware of those words and have opportunities to integrate those into their vocabulary.
Okay.
Thanks.
Great.
All great ideas. Yep.
Absolutely.
So one of the things, remember when we were talking a little bit about generation 1.5 students, and that they typically learn English through listening and speaking, and then that reading and writing piece kind of comes later. And at the same time, we know at NCU and in our graduate programs, reading and writing are very strong components. And so reading and writing become very important aspects of fluency. So one of the things that I found is helpful when supporting non-native English speakers is to capitalize on these 4 different ways that we learn a language and find ways to incorporate them into the feedback. So for example, one of the, I can't remember who said it in the chat now, let me find it, about using, sorry, I can't find it right now, but using audio and video, which I think is a really, really great way to combine different forms of language development. So I write the comments and then I record them. And so I'm speaking and the student is listening. So the student is reading and the student is listening to my feedback. And so I provide comments and I just don't read it, but I provide that extra context when I'm talking about it in the video and the audio. So I might define terms. I might do that direct instruction that I talked about in terms of vocabulary or grammar or something that really will support the students' writing in different ways. Other ways are to meet with students one-on-one, either in a video conferencing format and have a conversation with students so that they can listen, they can speak, they can read, they can see on the screen if you do a video conference what you wrote and talk about it and really combine these different components. I also also think that, just writing is a good exercise, and we do lots of writing at NCU. But I also ask my students to take notes when we have conferences. So take some notes about what we talk about, what your next steps are, and then send those to me in an email so that I can be sure that we have a shared understanding of what to do next. So I think one of the things that's really important for students who are non-native English speakers, but also lots of students could benefit from a combination of feedback strategies that provide different ways of presenting our message. I gave some examples there. Are other ways that some of you have found to combine feedback strategies, or other ways that you have found successful in supporting non-native English speakers in this way with your feedback?
And we will wait just a few moments while people might be able to share a few more thoughts on that. We have that's an interesting idea, John. What about NCU? What about NCU allows non-native speakers to write their dissertation in their native languages? That's several steps above me.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, super interesting. Yeah, and of course NCU doesn't, and yeah, I can't speak to that, but yeah, really interesting conversation, I think it would be.
Let's see here. I was born in the US, but raised in Mexico. When I first started learning English, I was 18 years old. What really helped me in understanding the language was taking a class of film. In this class, I had to force myself to understand the language because the homework was watching a movie in English without subtitles and make a summary about it. My goodness, Ruth. Throw you in, you either sink or swim, huh?
That was not combining strategies. That was, but so in terms of an academic program, Ruth,
Wow.
how might that transfer to what we do here at NCU? And I don't want to put you on the spot. If you have some ideas, please feel free to post them. If not, I think that's an interesting thing to reflect on because, I think that's an interesting exercise, and one that really does kind of just throw you in without,
Yes. It really does remind me of sink or swim,
Yeah.
strategy. Just
right. And hopefully we're not doing that here at NCU, and I try not to, but I mean, I do think, I think sometimes if we're not cognizant of what students need for support, it can feel like that. So I think that's
true.
Yeah. All right. So, okay, I was going to go on, but I do see pointing out the differences in sentence structure, for example, how some languages use subject, object, verb, but English uses subject, verb, object. Sorry, Emily, I just took your job and I read that from
perfect.
Janice. And that goes back to my point about direct instruction. And in my opinion, there are places for direct instruction. I think discovery learning is really important, and Socratic kinds of feedback is really important. But there comes, I think, a balance between the importance of the content versus the importance of grammar, vocabulary, and some of those kinds of things that are important to the writing. And so in my own practice, teaching, that would be something I would just provide some direct instruction about. And I would probably do that in a video that accompanies some written feedback and just talk about, here's a grammar error. And here's how you do it correctly. And I have a big fat grammar book somewhere here too, where I don't know the grammar rules, which is really interesting. As a native English speaker, I know what sounds right, but I can't always say why that's wrong. So I actually, look it up in my big fat grammar book and find the rules so that I can share that with the student.
There's a couple more things, Dr. Bedford. Karen has a question about Socratic in the chat, and then I'll let you address that. And then there's a couple people with their hands raised, so we'll see if we have time for that right now.
Okay, yep. So Socratic, sorry, I used one of those terms that we throw around in academia. We'll provide some context for that. So a Socratic teaching method is one that just asks open-ended questions. So it's the Socrates, asking those philosophical questions for which there may or may not be an answer. Hopefully in academia, there is an answer in my feedback. But it's, they're questions like, have you thought about this? Or, consider, these kinds of things. And so they're big questions that ask big ideas. I thought there was another word there. No, I'm sorry. Good. Okay.
But still, though, I think it's a good thing to bring up and just to address anyway, because you're right. It is one of those academia terms that we just throw around here.
And I think it's a really good example, Emily, of how we just use those words and then move on. And, if you don't have that in your vocabulary, I didn't provide any context for it at all. And so that's really a great example of that.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to see if Sharon can unmute, hopefully.
Yes. So with regard to the feedback, what has helped me with my professors is, like, for example, when I write a sentence or something and the sentence isn't correct, like you were saying, they will write it, like they'll rephrase it, because when they start saying like, oh, well, the subject and the verb and all this stuff, it's like, whoa, can you slow down on that a little bit? So them kind of like rewriting it, saying this is another way you can say this, or this would be a better way, or, more graduate level work type writing or whatever they want to use. But that has helped me a lot with my writing.
Goes back to that modeling. Yep. Great point.
Thank you, Sharon. And then I'm just going to see if we're able to have this if Saunders is able to unmute and share the thought they have, but I don't think so. We'll go ahead and carry on from here.
Okay. All right. So just here are just some different ways that I've thought about providing feedback, and I try to give it in a little bit more detailed way. So, something that, I might typically say if I'm in a hurry, and just, consider how you might revise this paragraph so it reflects a more scholarly tone. That seems fair enough. But when I say consider how you might, does that mean you should, or you should just think about it? So, sometimes, it's better just to be very clear about what you're asking for. Please rewrite this paragraph using more scholarly language, for example. And I think that's just what we were talking about. Here's a way that we could rewrite this to sound more scholarly. Here's an example of a model you can follow. Another one we just talked about, please correct your grammar. What does that mean? What's wrong with my grammar here? An example would be describe exactly what is wrong with the grammar there and how it's corrected and what that rule is. Citations to seminal authors would be more appropriate here. There's that language and that vocabulary. What's a seminal author? Do we always know what that is? So, something about these statements need to be cited by seminal authors. Then I provide a definition. And also, that seminal authors may not be current. So that's always kind of hanging out there, comes up later. Try to give all the information that a student needs in order to move forward. So, just some of the things to think about. use explicit instruction using imperatives. So rather than say, think about, tell students exactly what it is that you'd like them to do, provide direct instruction, provide context, and consider vocabulary. Just a few things to think about. Emily, were there any questions or anything in the chat about that? I know we're running just a little bit short on time here, so we'll move on if there wasn't anything.
Not at this time.
Okay, just some ideas. I'm sure that you all have some too, some things to think about. And these are some things that I'm working on in my own feedback as well. And I see John says, I think if instructors give examples of what they wish students to do in scaffolding, it would be helpful. Yep, that scaffolding, yep, provide small steps instead of saying the usage is incorrect. Yeah, you know, I mean, I think that, you know, to say it's incorrect is not always helpful. And especially for something like grammar here, you know, you could spend a lot of time going out and finding that out when it really is a part of that lifelong learning. And I think something that we could point out and then move on from. So just a little bit about writing instruction then. So that was feedback. And so as NCU faculty members, you know, sometimes I hear, well, I'm not a writing teacher, I'm a content person. But we know if you're a NCU faculty member, if you're a faculty member anywhere, you know that writing instruction is part of the instruction you provide. And so on the left here, we have kind of a very basic, very foundational, and, you know, my opinion, kind of an outdated mode of thinking about writing, where it's controlled, where it's static, where we mimic, where we model exactly. And I will say here is a place where I really have to balance providing examples and allowing students to develop their own style. One of the things that I discover when I provide examples is the material I get back is exactly like what I provided as an example. And sometimes that works because sometimes that's what you need. If you're writing a problem statement, according to NCU standards, if you're writing about, you know, a specific kind of research analysis, you know, there are certain ways to say that. In other cases, writing is partly developing your own style and playing with that and figuring out where you fit in that world of academic writing. So we do want to move to a more recursive, creating, learner-centered focus, and, you know, brings us back to some of the conversation we've already had. I think, and I don't remember who, I apologize for that, said that it's about revising and meeting the expectation rather than writing something and it may or may not meet its expectation and move on. But it's that recursive, and it's when students were able to scaffold students' learning and help them revise and draft and edit and proofread that learning occurs. So when we're talking about academic writing, there's kind of a blending of these two approaches. As I said, some of the things in a dissertation in particular are controlled, they are static, they do model. There are certain things you need to say and certain ways to say it. At the same time, we want to help students be creative and develop their own skills. So, you know, there's kind of a blending of strategies. So with that, let's do just a little bit of a kind of a brainstorm about that as well. So how do we support both of those kinds of strategies at the same time? Thoughts?
And while we wait here in terms of writing support strategies and how we support that, I just wanted to note while we're waiting for someone to respond about this. Dr. Mass said really great discussion and helpful examples. Appreciated hearing from some of the students as well too in the session. So, and I'd like to echo that sentiment as well.
I do too. I think one of the strengths of NCU is the conversations that can happen between faculty and students and alumni. We're all here really trying to reach the same goals. And I think it's really awesome when we can just sit down and have these academic conversations together. I appreciate that as well.
Absolutely. And right now, Dr. Bedford, I don't see anyone popping in a thought for this last piece, but I'm just going to give it one more second.
Yeah, and this one is tougher because again, you know, we are as NCU faculty anyway, we are content people. We aren't necessarily writing teachers. And so I think that, you know, this is just something I think we need to keep in mind and think about how we may do this best for students and be thinking about a balance between those things. And I think that's what it is.
And I did see that someone raised their hand again, so I'm going to hopefully, oh, are you able to speak?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okie doke. To answer this last one, what I've done, because I actually teach English as a foreign language overseas. And so for me, when it comes to that, I try to explain to them the differences between the words that they're using and the words that they mean to use, because I've lived primarily here teaching English in Latin American countries, and they have a lot of words that are similar, but when we use them, they have a different context. For example, one of the more funny ones is I'll have students that will say, I have relations with my boss. And I'm like, no, you have a relationship. Because in English, the word relations has a completely different context and meaning, and I have to explain that to them.
Yeah.
And it's not that you're wrong, but we can't interchange these two synonyms.
Right.
And I know what you mean. You really have a relationship with your boss. I don't think you have relations with your boss.
Right. That's it. Yeah, that's a great example. I love that. Yeah, you know, and I kind of, you know, have a tendency to say, I don't know what you mean here, and then move on. Well, you know, I mean, a student may say, I know what I meant. I don't know what else to say. So I try to, in those cases, say, did you mean this? Or was this perhaps the word you were thinking about? And I try to kind of dig in and see if I can figure out, you know, what it is that the student's trying to say. Or I say, you know, I do know what you're trying to say here. Here's a better way to say it. So, I mean, I think those are some strategies that we can use to, you know, again, help the student with those very basic kind of skills that provide the foundation, and then give them room and time and more opportunity for those creative, recursive kinds of skills. If they're not focusing on grammar and vocabulary and APA, which are very, very important, they have time to focus on those other things too. And fortunately, we have great support for those things here at NCU. We have the ASC who can also provide support on the other end and really give students kind of a two-pronged approach. So thank you. That was a great example.
Yes, absolutely.
So let's kind of meet back up with Saeed. And if we recall, he's a student who's a recent immigrant to this country, learning English, wants to get his doctorate, has a lot of personal things going on. And in the few minutes we have left, ideas about this particular student or maybe students similar, what we talked about today, or other ideas within the broader context of supporting students that we might think about when we encounter a student with this kind of profile.
And just, oh, Janice popped in there. I think it's important not to mark students down for errors of grammar and mechanics. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm not sure that is in correlation to this one. That might have been a thought.
That's fine.
from
Oh, that's
previous.
fine. That's fine. We'll take comments on anything at this point. It's fine. Yeah.
Sorry about
Yeah,
that, Janice.
Yeah. Yeah, they're important, but I think that they play part of a role. I mean, that is not the only thing that we need to consider when we're evaluating student work. And I do think that sometimes we need to give students a break for that.
And I am going to go ahead and we have a couple people that have raised their hand. If that's okay. Let's start with Sharon first.
I'm not trying to take everybody's space. I think the biggest thing here for me when I work with just different clients of different culture is just meeting them where they're at. So kind of like joining and meeting them where they're at and like working from there to kind of help like motivate them, moving towards the direction that they should be moving to. I think that's going to be the biggest thing. So like with him, just kind of meeting him where he's at, like understanding his worldview, his perspective, and where he's at, and trying to like create that cultural competence and then just go from there, like, and helping him move forward.
Nice. Yeah. And I think that goes for all students, whether they're non-native English speakers or whether they are adults dealing with competing priorities or someone who's not been to school for a long time and maybe needs some confidence built. I mean, there's a lot of situations, I think, in which that is a sentiment that we need to embrace.
All right. And I know we're a little bit over, but I'd like to give John the chance to talk if you're able to unmute, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking aloud. Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just thinking aloud whether it's possible or is it a part of the structure for professors and teachers teaching students from various English backgrounds to spend some time abroad in some of those particular countries and immerse themselves in the cultural language, because language carries culture. Language transmits knowledge, and language does so many things. It's not just the language of writing, but transmission of culture. So when we write as speakers of multiple languages, some of our writing may be lost in cultural translation.
Yeah.
That's my 2 cents. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great sentiment. And as a speaker of only one language, I have a lot to learn about that. So thank you for bringing that to the table, because I think that is really important.
Thank you, John. And Dr. Bedford, do you have any other last thoughts that you want to reflect on before we close out here?
Just that I thank everybody for the conversation today. And again, I think this is a really important topic, and I wanted to bring it to the table so we start talking about it, and we are comfortable, providing the support that all students need, regardless of their circumstance. Please feel free to email me, continue the conversation. I'm happy to do that. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. So I enjoy that conversation, and thank you all for coming here today. If you all want the presentation, I told Emily I'd make that available, and you can get that from her. A little bit of a bibliography that's also will be included in the presentation if you'd like to do a little bit more reading on some of these topics.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Bedford, for bringing this conversation to the table, so to speak, today in our webinar series. And I'd like to thank all the attendees so much for a great dialogue today and sharing ideas and thoughts on how we can all get better and support our non-native English speakers. So thank you very much. And I hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Yeah.